Hello, it's Pastor Quincy from Cuyahoga Falls Church of the Nazarene. I'm just here with a brief review of the first two episodes of The Chosen Season 5. Now, I'm going to do video study guide breakdowns of these episodes when they come out and are free for everyone to access on the Chosen app. Right now, they're just in theaters, but I had a chance to see them in theaters, thought I would give some initial thoughts. Now, they're going to be spoilers in what I share. I'm trying not to do heavy spoilers, but just some things that I noticed and want to keep an eye on for future episodes, and some general evaluations of what I saw. So if you don't want any spoilers, don't listen to this. Wait until you see the episodes. So we see two episodes. We see the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. We see Jesus weeping over the city of Jerusalem. And we see the beginning of setting up for the Last Supper and Jesus flipping over the tables in the temple courts. These are all things that happen in the Gospels. And then there's some other stuff that goes alongside of that. We see the disciples and how things are developing for them. And we see Jesus with a beautiful little interlude as he discovers a couple who have just been engaged and prays a blessing over them. Certainly the highlight scene for me was right there, just the beautiful nature of Jesus loving others, treating these people like his children, caring for them, and imagining Jesus praying over your marriage. Just a beautiful scene. The triumphal entry I thought was done really well. I enjoyed the insight into Jesus' vision as he flashes forward to when the Romans will come and destroy the city of Jerusalem and kill many of Jesus' people there, the Jews who are in the city. And Jesus is weeping over that. Jesus is sad over the choices that they are making to reject their true Messiah, the Prince of Peace, which will eventually lead them into this armed conflict against Rome that ends terribly and for centuries ended with the people of Israel exiled from their capital city of Jerusalem, and the temple still hasn't been rebuilt from that. So Jesus is seeing this happening and he's moved by it, and I thought they did that extremely well. A couple things to watch as you see these episodes. We have this hooded figure who has shown up before in the scene where Lazarus is raised from the dead. So that figure comes back, and it's not identified for us who he is. We get to hear him talk as he confronts Caphne and those who are with him who have come to try to drive Jesus out as a false prophet and cause his death. So that we see him talk. We don't discover who he is. I think perhaps the most telling moment is Atticus notices this hooded man in the crowd. And if you notice, Atticus sees him and then looks back and the man has disappeared. To me, that seemed very clearly to be a supernatural disappearance. It wasn't able for him to move quite that quickly without some sort of supernatural ability, which goes to my thought that this is probably a incarnated Satan taking on some sort of form. I think that's probably what this is going to end up being. Notice also that when he comes on screen, there's sort of a rattlesnake sound to the soundtrack. I don't think he's a good character. Of course, this all could be a red herring, and he could turn out to be someone else. The fact that he's taking notes would make me say, okay, maybe this is Luke. Maybe this is some kind of Greek who's hanging out and taking notes over who Jesus is. But I really do think that it's Satan or some kind of demonic emissary. Another interesting thing to monitor, when Zebedee and John drop off the olive oil at the temple, John has an extended conversation with a man named Marcus, and a servant of the high priest mentioned this character, servant of the high priest mentioned in the Gospels and connected to John. I wonder if this eventually is Mark, the writer of the Gospel of Mark. So something to monitor, something to think about as the show continues. And as down the road, we are expecting to have a series about the book of Acts. Mark would certainly appear in that series. So those are a couple of things to notice and think about as you watch the episode. We obviously have some continued developments of Pilate's wife being upset, being in turmoil, of Atticus, who I think is going to be that centurion who says, surely this was the Son of God, trying to confront who Jesus is. And then we have an interesting interplay of scenes from the Last Supper being shown to us throughout this episode. And throughout each of the episodes, it seems we'll get glimpses of the Last Supper. So there might be a final episode where we get kind of a big chunk of Last Supper content, but spreading it throughout all the episodes, I think helps orient the viewer towards what Jesus is trying to get across to his disciples in these last days on earth that he has with them. One thing I thought was interesting was the scene where Jesus tells his disciples to buy a sword. This scene tells you a lot about how a theologian thinks of Jesus and the concept of violence. I found it to be somewhat unclear, but I think The Chosen leans towards Jesus saying there might be a time where you have to use violence. And I think that is an incorrect interpretation of the scene. I think Jesus makes pretty clear when he says, sell your cloak and buy a sword, and the disciples say, look, we've got 2 swords, and Jesus says, that's enough. I think the implication from what he's saying is, that's enough, you've missed the point. If 2 swords is enough for 12 disciples or 11 disciples, then obviously the point isn't that you should have a sword to defend yourself. The point isn't that you should have a little bit of defense that you offer. The point is the same Jesus who said, love your enemies, is calling you into a life where you're going to wish you had a sword, where you're going to be hunted, where you're going to have enemies. But this is still the same Jesus who says, turn the other cheek, love your enemies, and who's about to lay down his life for his enemies. So this wasn't a real strong message from the show, but I do think I differ a little bit in how they see it, and it certainly is open to interpretation. I'm not claiming that my interpretation is the only one, but it is interesting, and we may see that in later episodes, that when Peter strikes the servant of the high priest, which again, that may be Marcus who we met before, maybe Peter strikes his ear, and that's eventually the person that we see in that scene. But when Peter strikes his ear and Jesus says, put your sword away, those who live by the sword die by the sword, the Christians for 300 years seem to interpret that as Jesus saying, we are not meant to take up weapons against each other, against our enemies. That is not what Jesus wants for us. So I kind of hope the show eventually ends up there. Did kind of lead me to ask questions about how would Peter, who seems so devoted, so zealous for Jesus, eventually deny him. And I wonder how big that scene is where Peter strikes to defend Jesus and Jesus says, put your sword away. I could call on legions of angels to protect me. Those who live by the sword die by the sword. And then gets carried away by his enemies, by his betrayer, to be crucified, to experience this worst kind of humiliation, suffering, death. I wonder if that puts Peter in the position that we see Judas in this episode, where Judas is saying, Jesus isn't the Messiah that we wanted. He isn't the Messiah that I need. He's not going to defend himself. He's going to take L after L after L. He's just not the kind of Messiah that I want. And if that's where Peter felt, Peter denied Jesus because he felt abandoned by a Jesus who would not defend himself when defense was clearly possible, where he clearly had the power to do that. Interesting to see this show develop these themes. I can't wait to see episodes 3, 4, and 5 coming up this next week. Hope you enjoyed this quick little review, and I'll give a quick little review of those next 3 episodes once I have a chance to see them.